everyone. On behalf of the People's Lobby and Oak Park Call to Action, I welcome you to Re-envisioning Community Safety, a public conversation with elected officials. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that this space we are occupying is the territory of Indigenous people who have cared for this land for thousands of years. My statement serves as a reminder to all of us that we are obliged to review our own commitment to the understanding of the present-day Indigenous people among us. My name is Kate Redling, and I am part of a group of really, really hardworking folks who put this event together tonight. I'd like to recognize the host committee who helped organize this event, and as I call your name, please stand, all of you together. Stacy Austin, Erica Bachner, Kevin Barner, Suzanne Fairfax, Leah Fluke, Barika Grant, Shobha Medvedev. Thank you. Jamie Flecka, Tim Thomas, and Erica Washington. Thank you very much. I'd also like to recognize the staff of our fabulous facility here, the People's Library of Oak Park. For their great space and services, thank you very much. So why are we here tonight? Because right now there are over 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. That's more people than any other nation on earth. 25% of the world's imprisoned people are right here in the US, despite the fact that we only comprise 5% of the world's population. 1 in every 100 people in the United States is incarcerated. Throughout the United States, the bulk of municipal budgets goes towards policing. Here in Oak Park, for example, approximately 40% of our village budget goes to policing. Chicago spends more than $1.5 billion annually on policing. In the Austin neighborhood right next door, more than $550 million was spent incarcerating residents from 2005 to 2009. Think about what we could do with $550 million. But despite the tremendous resources we spend on policing and incarceration, those dollars do not translate into safety or security. In fact, it's one of the main causes of insecurity in our communities. Encounters with police are traumatizing and potentially deadly for our Black and brown neighbors. And rather than creating rehabilitation, after serving time, it's extremely difficult for people to find living wage jobs, safe and secure housing, or the health and services that they need. So rather than teaching a lesson, it's creating recidivism. Working within the coalition to end money bail, we've won bond reforms that have allowed thousands of our Cook County neighbors to remain at home while awaiting trial, rather than locked up in Cook County Jail simply because they were too cash-strapped to post bond. The People's Lobby has been working on criminal justice reform for the last 8 years. We believe the root causes of crime and violence will be addressed not through increased policing and incarceration, but by substantial public investments in our people and in our communities. Since Kim Foxx was elected in 2016, we've reported extensively on her progress towards reforms that she's championed. These reports can be found at thepeoplesLobbyusa.org. And there's a resource sheet at the back of the room if you would like more details about that and all of the facts that you'll hear tonight. Right back there at the back of the room. The People's Lobby has had a strong point of view, yet our intent tonight is to engage in substantive conversation with the 3 elected officials who we believe are using their power to actually make our community safer. Each panelist will make an opening statement answering the question, how are you using your power to advance policies that make our community safer through a lens of racial equity and economic justice? After opening statements, we'll also introduce questions from the room. You can submit a question on the index card that was on your chair, and we will be collecting them. Look for somebody with a basket or a hand up. If your question is directed at a specific panelist, please indicate that. Please be mindful that folks in the room want to hear responses from the policymakers in our community, and we cannot accommodate any debating tonight. After we're done, you're going to hear about the ways that you can get involved in this effort. That's what the blue cards are for, so keep those handy. Blue sheet on your seat. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Erica Washington. Erica is an attorney and dedicated civil leader volunteering in Oak Park, and Erica is going to share a story of her lived experience growing up in Chicagoland.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you all for being here tonight. Oftentimes, when we think of safety, we limit it to the context of wrongdoers and wrongdoing, the absence of criminal activity. Community safety, however, is much more comprehensive and holistic. Safety is economic security and the political power to have a say over what happens in our communities. Characteristics of community safety include racial and economic justice, access and investment, a system where we don't only look to measure incidents, individuals, and the penal system. My family's story illustrates how the combination of systemic racism and unregulated capitalism ensure that Black communities don't have economic security, and that Black families who do make it into the middle class have a very tenuous foothold there. My family originates from the South and migrated to Chicago during the 50s and 60s in search of better opportunities and communities within which to build a life for themselves. My mother, the oldest of 7, was raised in rural Mississippi and comes from a family of sharecroppers. As sharecropping was ushered out, the primary source of income for many women in her small town was to be house help for white families. That included my grandmother. My mother was not interested in that type of work, which she witnessed firsthand yield very little return. So she left Mississippi, went to Memphis, where she met my father, who's also the oldest of 7. Together, they moved to Chicago in 1969 in search of employment opportunities with livable wages. Within 5 years, they obtained jobs they would stay in for decades and purchased their first home, all the while continuing to support their families back home in the South. In 1980, with a growing family, my parents decided to move us out to the far South suburbs, where there were good schools, a vibrant economy, safe neighborhoods, and affordable homes. This area is in the southeastern part of Cook County, which borders Will County, such as Park Forest, Matson, and University Park. When we first arrived, our neighborhood and surrounding villages were predominantly white. A lot of young Black families, first-time homeowners, with a similar narrative to that of my parents, were also moving into those areas. The white flight was rapid and stark. I recall having friends of other races during preschool and kindergarten, and then almost instantly, they started to disappear without notice. One day we'd be playing freeze tag, and the next day had moved, with no goodbye or no let's stay in touch. By the time I was in 3rd grade, the ratio of Black and white residents had switched. My neighborhood had changed from 80 to 90% white to 80 to 90% Black. At that time, I only had about 2 white classmates. The same was more or less true for neighboring communities. Yet the local restaurants, retail stores still appeared to be patronized by an equal proportion of each race, which looked like true integration. Our secret was that while we mixed in commercial centers, our neighborhoods were increasingly segregated by race. Despite the white flight, there was, for a period of time, a thriving shopping and recreational sector with long-term tradition and history, intergenerational ownership, and a bustling presence within a 5-mile radius. The area was so close-knit that neighbors knew everyone on their block, most within their town, and were within only a few degrees of separation from folks who lived in neighboring villages. During evenings and weekends, you would see front doors of homes open, children playing, bicycles in driveways, and grills fired up. The gains that my parents made by raising our family in a stable community allowed them to make great strides for their families, past and future. For instance, they sent me to college and law school. They provide for their grandchildren and continue to provide for their siblings, parents, and it also has permitted retirement. Within the past 5 years, however, much has changed. Many businesses have closed, town centers are vacant, multiple grocery stores have closed, school closures have begun, and in one neighborhood, the water has been contaminated with lead. These changes happened much sooner in many other Black neighborhoods in the Chicago metropolitan area, Austin, Inglewood, South Shore. The dominant narrative says that we as Black folks are to blame for the decline of our neighborhoods. But government policies of redlining, racist appraisal systems, devalue predominantly Black areas, and a lack of public investment has created this pattern. As recently as 1973, federal housing appraising manuals operated with a list of the desirability of neighborhoods of white Europeans at the top and of African Americans and Mexican Americans at the bottom. The private market will not make our neighborhoods safer, except through wholesale displacement and gentrification. We need to fight for public policies that address economic inequality with a focus on racial equity. Now we will hear from Tim Thomas, who's a fellow Oak Parker and longtime activist for social justice and progressive policies.
So good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Erica. Her story really illustrates why we need to re-envision and redefine what public safety means. Our political leadership at every level has decided to invest in massive resources of policing and incarceration as an attempt to manage an economic and social crisis in Black and brown communities, rather than just undo those racist policies and practices that have created this crisis. Oak Park doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are adjacent to communities that are suffering profoundly from racist disinvestment. This impacts how we actually police our own community. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Royal Youth Group, who, at a recent village board meeting, they laid out why Oak Park needs to reallocate resources from more officers and direct those funds towards opportunities that benefit the youth. And so if your kids are in the Royal Youth Group or if they're in here, I want to tell you, job well done. We appreciate it. For the last 2 years, I've hosted brake light clinics throughout Oak Park and Austin. I've changed tail lights, brake lights, license plate lights, all for free. Because people of color get pulled over and they have to deal with the unintended consequences of a common mechanical failure due to a lack of finances to pay for that repair. What does that mean for Black folks? 64% of all stops in Oak Park are of Black and Latinx drivers. Why is that? Now, regardless of the time of day, what you'll notice is that Black and Latinx drivers are stopped at a much more higher rate than our Caucasian counterparts. Now, if you're looking at this slide, you'll notice 2017 data and residency analysis. What you'll notice is that non-Oak Parkers are stopped at a significantly higher rate than Oak Parkers. 22% of Oak Parkers who live here are being stopped versus 78% of the other folks who are in our community, who are spending money, who are just here shopping, passing through, or what have you. What we know and what we understand from the previous slides is why are we stopping so many people that don't live here? And what you notice from the previous slides is that many of those folks are overwhelmingly Black and Latinx people. Now, if you look at this slide, I want you to examine the demographics and the stops pretty closely. What you'll notice is that Black folks make up about 19% of the community, 29% of the stops. Latinx people make up 8% of the community, 6% of the stops. White people make up 64% of the community, and only 61% of the stops. Black people are stopped at 1.5 times higher rate than their representation in the community. Why is this happening? It doesn't make sense. Non-Oak Park residents, if you look at this slide, are being hit the hardest. We are overwhelmingly policing Black and brown folks. This is a Trump-style way of figuring out who belongs here. Do we really want to be like that? We're policing Black and brown folks out of our own community. In Oak Park, we have a policy of call 911 for everything. It's kind of the kitchen sink approach to policing. It really creates more harm than it does good. It further traumatizes Black and brown communities. It allows the police to overstate their importance in the community. And it really creates undue stress on folks just for living while being Black. Our own police chief said Oak Park is a very safe community. One of the major crimes that happens here and gets the most news is carjackings. 36 carjackings in the last 3 years. And while any of carjacking is way too much, I want to put that in perspective that we have had 418 cases of domestic battery in the same time period. And we know domestic battery goes unreported. We can either decide to invest in the public good, that fight for economic security in our village, and to be part of the fight to win those things on the state and federal level, or we can take the Trumpian approach and build kind of a metaphorical wall around investing in policing, creating more cages, with dire consequences for Black and brown folks. Let's do something different. Let's allocate resources differently. Let's get in front of these issues instead of reacting to them. It's like preventative medicine. And think of it that way. We all know that diet and exercise can significantly reduce the need of prescription drugs for things like blood pressure and diabetes. Let's stop popping pills and let's really look at the root cause of what's going on. Thank you. I'll turn it back over.
So we've got some questions already in hand. You can keep submitting your questions as well on the note cards. We will try to get through these before we do any follow-up questions. So we're going to have a lot of questions to get through, I'm sure. So I'll go ahead. Arti Walker-Peddakotla won election to the Oak Park Board of Trustees in April of this year, and she has been a fierce advocate for policies that advance racial equity. Brandon Johnson, our 1st District Cook County Commissioner, is a dedicated father, husband, and former Chicago Public School teacher and Chicago Teachers Union organizer. He's a zealous advocate for working class families, investment in communities, and workers. As Cook County State's Attorney, Kim Foxx runs an office of over 800 assistant state's attorneys for Cook County. An equally challenging role, she is the mom of 4 teenagers.
More challenging.
More challenging, I totally attest to that. State's Attorney Foxx has championed racial equity and restorative justice throughout her 1st term and served as a national model for progressive prosecution. You each have a mic. There's a little doohickey on there. Push it up so it's on. Each of you are going to have 3 minutes to answer the following question. I'm happy to repeat it for each of you. We're all going to know this question by the end of the night. How are you using your power to make our community safer with respect to racial equity and economic justice?
So hi everybody, I got elected in April 2nd of this year. And from the very beginning, I was a very unconventional candidate. I won by the skin of my teeth, really. It was not an easy race, and I had a huge community behind me that got me into office. All of the slides that you just saw that showed all of the breakdown of what's happening in Oak Park policing are from a group that I helped create called Freedom to Thrive Oak Park. And Freedom to Thrive is a coalition of community members, community leaders representing organizations that are actually investigating how we police our community. And I believe as an elected official in an inside-outside strategy, where I not only have to work inside my role as an elected official to push policy change, but I have to empower the community and lift up the community to recognize their power, because we need more people pushing for change on the outside. We need people holding me and everybody else accountable. So all of those slides that you saw will be released in a report. We have been working for the last 6 months. The data that you saw was all FOIA from our government. It was not easy to get. We've researched three policy areas. One is the budget. How much do we spend on policing in Oak Park? And it's about 40% of our general funds. So 40% of your property taxes goes to policing. The second is the FOIA data that you saw. And the third is the policy. So what are the laws that govern policing in Oak Park? And how can we change them so that we can have an accountable and equitable policing strategy in Oak Park. And that is how I'm using my power.
Good evening, everyone. Really excited to be here this evening. I do want to just thank one of my political mentors, the state senator of this fine district. I know he'll be acknowledged later, but Don Harmon is here. So if you all just make me feel good by helping him feel good. So for those of you who are not familiar with my story, I am raising my family in Austin, not too far from here. My wife and I were raising 3 children, and unlike our state's attorney, I think my children probably still like me a little bit more. But I do know there's one in particular that I'm losing slowly every single day. We are very proud to be residents of the Austin community. In fact, I actually believe it's one of the most dynamic neighborhoods in the entire country. And I'm not just simply saying that because my property taxes remind me every single day how invested I am in the community, but when you think about all the assets that Austin has, from the Green Line to the Blue Line, Chicago Avenue Bus, Austin Bus, we have an amazing parks throughout the entire community. The housing stock is amazing. It is the largest city inside of the city of Chicago, but yet somehow the only response that you have from the political apparatus is to police a community that is as dynamic as Austin. The question about how I'm attempting to use my power, a couple of things. One, some of you might be familiar, one of the main pieces of legislation that I was proud to sponsor as a freshman Cook County Commissioner was the Just Housing Ordinance, where this ordinance will eliminate discrimination against families who have criminal past and arrest records. It's very important if we're going to reshape and transform the way we do politics here in Cook County and through Illinois. We cannot continue to have barriers in place that prevent people from accessing opportunity. The second thing, the gang database at the county level, and I know folks in this room are part of that coalition, to end that, we eradicated the county sheriff's gang database. The neighborhoods of the highest concentration of individuals on that gang database live in the 1st District, Austin, Garfield Park, and West Humboldt. But somehow our communities were not being invested in, and we weren't getting any safer by having a racist system that continues to capture our people in a system that, quite frankly, is racist. I've said this before, the gang database had someone on that database that was over 100 years old, and which is obviously the oldest G in the history of America. But there was also very troubling that there was a 6-year-old in that gang database as well. That's criminal. The third thing that I've been attempting to do over the last year to exercise power to transform how we do work in Cook County is that there was something that was brought before the Cook County Board of Commissioners. There was an appropriation for $16 million for 50 tasers. 50 tasers, $16 million. I was proud that I was one of 7 commissioners that voted against that appropriations. In my last 30 seconds, because I know our state's attorney is probably not going to do this tonight. One of the things I'm going to continue to do to exercise our power is to make sure that she gets another 4 years as our state's attorney.
Let me begin by saying it is always an honor and a privilege to be back in Oak Park as a former Oak Park resident and one who feels still deeply committed to this community. Thank you for having me. We made some news today about the use of our power. I'm wearing a green tweed suit because today we vacated the first 1,012 convictions of those who had previously been convicted of marijuana possession. started the day, and it was rather cheeky that I was wearing a green tweed suit purposely, that I was on my way to the courthouse, that I became incredibly overwhelmed about what this moment represented, not just for us in Cook County, but for this state. The power of the prosecutor and the power to charge or not charge, the gatekeeper of the criminal justice system, to have been a part of historic legislation that I've been so proud and honored to work with Senator Harmon on around legalization of cannabis, for which he has been a progressive leader. It's one thing to talk about making policies and vote on policies, and prosecutors who historically have stood on the side of pushing for penalty enhancements, pushing for stronger sentences, being foot soldiers in the war on drugs, and doing so because we said that that's what the law dictated. It is another thing to be there today and say not only are we not going to pursue poor policy, but to actively work to dismantle it. And not only actively work to dismantle it, but to also try to right the wrongs, to repair the harm that we've done. And so, you know, I'm honestly a little full today, having done that, because I stood at a podium with the governor in the jury box and stood before Judge Evans and read the names of 100 largely men. I think there were 94 men and 6 women whose names that I read into the record. Overwhelmingly African American, overwhelmingly Latino, who have been locked out of opportunities where they shouldn't even have to mark on an application for rental whether they've been convicted of a cannabis possession. That the folks who we've had young people who have been unable to apply for college scholarships or financial aid. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, there are people like John Boehner who are going to make millions of dollars off of the cannabis industry. While there are people who live in neighborhoods like the neighborhoods that Commissioner Johnson invests his tax dollars in. Their entrepreneurial spirit hasn't been recognized by the markets, but by our prison system. And so I would say, using my power, it's a tricky wicket when you use your power in non-traditional ways. When you use your power to right wrongs, to correct and to call out systemic issues like racism and redlining and the historical disinvestment in communities. I try to use my voice to say the areas where we see the highest concentrations of violence are the same places we see the highest unemployment rates, the lowest educational attainment. And it's not because those communities aren't full of people who have potential access, but they don't have opportunity. And that when we invest in things like the justice system at such a disproportionate rate, we are then condoning the fact that we are disinvesting from those things that actually keep our communities safer. What I will say, and I've said it everywhere I go, take money from my budget, shrink my budget, and tell me then that I don't have to use our criminal justice system to deal with things that don't belong there, like mental health and substance use disorder. Take it. Take it. And then reallocate those dollars to investments in our communities. If I don't have to prosecute another person who is struggling with addiction issues or struggling with mental health issues and can focus solely on violence that's ravaging our communities and work to invest in others, I think we would be a better use of those property tax dollars, which is why I love Oak Park, y'all pay a lot. Really do. But then I moved to Flossmoor, and we play a ridiculous amount, and we don't have a nice downtown like you. But using those tax dollars in a way that's more efficient and keep our community safer, that's how I want to use my power.
Thank you all for your responses. At this time, we're going to start by asking the panel questions submitted by folks in the audience. I invite you all again to submit more questions with the note cards provided. We ask that our public officials limit your answers to around a minute or so that we can get through as many questions as possible. First question is for State's Attorney Foxx. It's a two-part question. What types of incidents do you believe are most appropriately resolved outside of the criminal court and instead through resources within the community? And what additional resources do we need from local, state, and county governments to do this more comprehensively?
Yeah, I said earlier this year, in January of this year, I believe that most nonviolent offenses can be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system. We have this unhealthy addiction of believing that everything must be resolved in the criminal courts. I believe that diversion should be our default for most cases that don't involve violence. And when I say that, people nod until we divert somebody people don't like. I'm just gonna smile at that. But when we look at our resources at the State's Attorney's Office, we're the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. The fact of the matter is 40% of the cases that come through our office, 40% are drug cases. 40. Of that 40%, 60% are simple drug possession cases. So the fact of the matter is if we reallocate resources and dollars to deal with issues that are outside of the purview of the justice system, we cannot simply say we believe addiction is a public health issue and don't invest in public health. We cannot talk about the fact that we don't have resources for mental health services and we all agree that we need them, but ask me to prosecute people who have a manic episode outside of Pete's Fresh Market. We have that addictive quality of saying, we say one thing, but when it's time to like do or show, we tend to do otherwise. And so I think we need to disinvest from prosecuting cases or using the criminal justice system for things that can be dealt with in the community, and we need to double down on our commitment to those resources within communities.
Thank you. The next question is for Trustee Walker-Peddakotla and Commissioner Johnson. How could passing the fair tax contribute to economic security that creates a foundation for real public safety?
So I talked about this a lot during the campaign. I actually brought Daniel Biss here to have a conversation with Oak Park because Oak Park seems to be really struggling with the idea of a fair tax. The number one complaint that I got during my run for office was property taxes are too high and you as a trustee absolutely have to do something about them. During our budget cycle, which just ended last Monday, we were forced by a large, a pretty sound component of the community to hold our levy request, even though we are a home rule community, to 3%. What that means, and what that meant for us, is because we have state mandated pension payments, that we had to cut funding for things like the Youth Interventionist Program, which is a mental health program, the very programs that we need to fund. We had to cut our funding for that program. We cut funding for the Oak Park Regional Housing Center by a little bit by the amount that was requested by Athena Williams. And we had to fight tooth and nail just to get that line item in the budget. And so what really local governments are on the front lines of disinvestment from state and federal tax dollars. So when we're not receiving those state and federal tax dollars, we then cannot serve our community in the way that we really need to serve our community. And so what I've told people is that the fair tax, it's going to take a while. It'll take about 7 years with what Daniel Biss has told me to see that sort of equitable distribution of tax dollars. But that is the long-term solution to getting a fair tax distribution across all of our residents. And we really need to be fighting for this because there are so many people in our community that don't believe in it. And if we want that to pass, we really have to be fighting for it.
Look, I think that tax is absolutely critical to the solvency of our state. And when it comes to the things that I believe people in this room care about, and I'll just pose a couple of questions. Do we believe that all of our schools in the state of Illinois should be funded in an equitable way? We're invested in trauma-related services, and we're expanding opportunities for folks to actually learn and engage in a way that doesn't limit education to a few rote tests. Do we believe that housing should be made affordable? Do we believe that we really need massive investment in our infrastructure? In the first district, you all know that there are villages in the first district where the alleys are still filled with gravel, or they're not paved. That in Maywood we have a leakage where the water's not going to make it all into our residents' homes, and they're paying more for their water, and then it's contaminated. In my neighborhood, we saw on the slide, we have literally $1 million blocks. $1 million blocks as it relates to how the criminal system has targeted black people in particular. And so I think the question that we have to ask is, do we believe that healthcare is a guaranteed human right? Is that what we're fighting for? And so if we believe in those fundamental values, then we have to pay for them. Now, I didn't hide, from you all when I ran for Cook County Commissioner. I know some of you are still bothered by the number of pieces of mail that I sent. Sorry. That's why I put my children on the mailer, so you feel less sorry for me. But there are three things. Look, we have to make sure that we are protecting and expanding public accommodations. Be very clear. The fact that we have, I'm a very candid here with family here. We have two presidential candidates, you all, right now, that are from the East Coast, that are white, running on the black liberation movement. Fred Hampton said clinics. Fred Hampton said free lunch, free breakfast. This is like if you want to see black people and brown people in particular liberated in this country, you cannot do it without massive investment. In fact, it's almost an insult to suggest that we are better off investing hundreds of millions of dollars into my incarceration, but somehow my child having a library or a librarian is some sort of inconvenience. We invest in our future.
Thank you. The next question is for each of the public officials. Does your respective government entity partner with any community-based organizations and institutions that serve as an intervention for vulnerable populations who in many cases are subject to a high rate of arrest, such as youth, persons of color, homeless, or those who are experiencing a mental health crisis?
Yeah, the county level, and this is 1 year in, we don't do it enough. Yeah, there are some organizations that we fund through the Justice Advisory Council. There are grants that we offer for community-based organizations. There are a couple of folks in this room that we've been in conversations with. I brought the president out to our district, a few weeks ago. We don't do it enough, to be perfectly honest with you all. That's why it was difficult for me to vote for $16 million for 50 tasers. I've had organizations come to me within this first year where they had $100,000, it would revolutionize how they did programming. There's a sister in this room right now. If we actually gave her support and resources to help deal with the trauma that families deal with when they lose a loved one, it would shift the dynamics of our communities. And so is there some investment? Yes. But quite frankly, most of our budget goes to our health and hospitals and, of course, our criminal system, which is our courts and our county jail. But it really requires revenue. And as much as I'm proud that we've been able to fund some key programs in the first district, it's not close to enough to what we need.
So I will say in this 7 months that I've been on the board, there have been some wins, but there have been also some major losses. The Youth Interventionist Program is a major loss. Because that is free mental health care for young people. When the rates of, there was just a report in the Wednesday Journal that said that the rates of kids that are having suicidal tendencies or ideations is actually going up in our high school. And so that program absolutely needs the village government support. We also, when we say partner, we don't actually partner with agencies that really are doing work to sustain an integrated community, for example. I made comments at the board table about how we partner with economic development corporations to bring more high-rises here and more high-end apartments, but we don't partner really well with corporations that focus on low-income housing, that focus on making sure that everybody can find a home. We don't do a good enough job of that. What I'll say is that 2021 is coming up real quick. There are 4 trustee seats up for grabs, and y'all need to be running for office, because the only way we see these things change is to vote out people that are not serving our community. I as one trustee cannot do anything because I've gotten voted down on almost everything that I wanted to do. The only thing that I was able to get passed is getting free water filters for residents that are undergoing water main work on their streets, so that we could prevent lead exposure, because that wasn't happening before I got into office. But there needs to be more of this. There needs to be more people on the board that think like this. There needs to be more people on the board that have experienced pain, because the people that experience the most pain in the world need to be the ones at the seat of power making policy decisions. So we need y'all to run.
Everything she said. Listen, we partner with a lot of different groups because I, again, believe the way that we shrink our footprint is by allowing those who have expertise in this space to be out in front. And quite frankly, I'm a prosecutor's office, and so for some of the work that we do, we don't have the expertise to do, and quite honestly, we don't have credibility in certain communities to do it. And so, for example, one of the areas that we have expanded our partnerships have been around our work with immigrant communities. When this president came into office, we came into office at the same time, and his, quickly with the travel ban and the Muslim ban and all of the things that he was doing, what we saw that it was having an impact on how we were able to do our jobs. When we talk, and I appreciated the statistic about domestic violence, what we were seeing was we had victims of domestic violence who were afraid to come to court because they'd seen on television in places across the country that there were ICE agents waiting at courthouses to arrest people. And so we quickly partnered with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights to put out a list of, know your rights and things that they could do. But I didn't have the credibility. I have a badge to knock on the door and say, hey, here's what you should do when law enforcement comes, because I'm law enforcement. And so we partnered with them to set up a hotline to be able to have them be the liaison between us and communities. We also hired our first ever in the office immigration policy director, because what we saw and what we heard from those communities that we were working with was the collateral consequences of a conviction are exponentially higher for those who are undocumented. So even as today, when we were vacating marijuana convictions, for someone who is an undocumented resident, their consequences were still high. And so it changed and shaped how we did our policy, where we were vacating convictions, not just expunging them, so that we could have the broadest possible relief. And so I say all that to say, I think we have learned and have had our best policy efforts when the people who are closest to the problem are directly impacted by our policies are the ones who are sitting at the table with us and guiding them. And whether that's on domestic violence, we meet quarterly with our domestic violence advocates throughout the county, and we learn things about, for example, survivors who find themselves being defendants when they're defending themselves. And what we learned was we learned a lot about this in mitigation packets once they've been convicted and are about to be sentenced. Information that we need to know at the charging decision. And we've changed the way that we've charged cases. We've gone back and vacated convictions. We have seen, even in cases that we thought were incredibly severe, we've changed our position because the advocates who do that work were at the table with us. And so I believe partnership is absolutely essential, that my policy initiatives and priorities may not be meeting the needs of the people I serve, so the people who are impacted have to have a seat at the table and a opportunity to direct the menu.
Thank you. Our next question is for Trustee Walker-Peddakotla and State's Attorney Foxx. How are the Oak Park and Chicago Police Departments working towards racial equity-based community safety?
So I will answer this to start, because I think I've had some conversations with the police chief, both in regular sessions of the board and executive sessions. I don't think we're doing enough. This is why I created Freedom to Thrive. This is why I pulled in community members. I pulled in Royal, which is the youth group that was mentioned. I gotta stop saying kids. Somebody always wanted, don't call them kids. But they were the young people that came to the village board and said, hey, these are my interactions with the police, and these interactions are causing us trauma. So why the heck are you asking for a $35 million line item in the capital improvement plan to fund a new police station? And why isn't that money going to a community center? So I feel like, and the rhetoric that's used is just so problematic, right? When I make any statements about the police at the board table, the one thing that I get told by other trustees is that you're maligning the entire police department. Now, I served in the Army. I served in the U.S. Army. And I call out the Army all the time. Whoever said that? Yeah. I call out the Army all the time because I think that the military-industrial complex, we spend 70% of our federal budget, whatever it is, 60 to 70% of our federal budget on the military so that we can police Black and brown and predominantly Muslim countries overseas. That's really what we're doing with our military. I, as an American citizen and as a resident, have the absolute right to question who is actually enacting our safety. And I think everybody does. And that isn't maligning the police department. That's asking, are we using these tax dollars in the most reasonable and humane way possible? And so I don't think we're doing enough. Every time I ask the police department, well, what are we doing? They keep on telling me, well, we're using 21st century policing. I don't know what the hell that means. I don't know what that means. And so Freedom to Thrive is all about getting community leaders in the room and us writing those policies to define what it means for community safety for us. What does it mean to have a police interaction for us so that our Black and brown young people are not going through trauma with the interactions that they have.
So I'll speak to the Chicago Police Department portion. I think one of the greatest things that we have going right now to address this issue is the consent decree. And it is unfortunate that it took a series and a history of tragedy to get us to the point where we have to reckon with that history, but also have to report on everything that we're doing to remedy that. And so, it is early. The consent decree was just signed off on in February. But I think having the ability to look at the presentation before we came on stage and look at the data. Our office is very data-driven. We're the first prosecutor's office in the country to put every piece of felony case level data on an open data portal. We have data dashboards because there's no other place than law enforcement where policy is driven by anecdote and not facts. It's anecdote. When I heard about as somebody knows somebody who got robbed, and so everybody is getting robbed. You know this. But when you look at the numbers and you look at the data, you're able to make the case. When you're talking about the number of people are stopped and who is stopped and how, if you can't fix what you can't measure, you can't actively work on dismantling practices where racism is baked in if you start with the notion that there is no racism baked in. And the way that you're able to substantiate that, because talking about race is really, there's a visceral thing that happens, particularly for those of us who are like, no, not me, and not in communities like mine. I just don't like that type of behavior. But when you see, that people are stopped disproportionately, when you see that people are charged disproportionately, one of the reasons that this marijuana legislation was so significant, the data has shown forever that people use marijuana along racial lines at the same rates. And yet people who are arrested and prosecuted in the city of Chicago, African Americans were arrested and prosecuted 4 times the rate of whites. And so then you can start asking the series of questions where it's not necessarily a judgment of you. How have you decided to use your resources? Where are you doing the types of stops where you find this? We're not really checking on college campuses for people using marijuana. I don't know what college you went to. I know if we really wanted to bust people for using marijuana, you go to Northwestern, you go to University of Chicago, you go to DePaul, you go to Loyola, and not on 63rd and Ashland. And so I think the ability for us to reckon with race and policing requires us to be more thoughtful and willing to engage in data, and willing to disengage and disabuse the fact that we can be participating in a system that has these outcomes with the purest of intentions. But pure intentions and horrible outcomes still are horrible. And so I think that's how we have to do it. And I think the consent decree in the city of Chicago, and I'm really optimistic about the new leadership, whomever it may be that will come in, who has to come in to a department and is mandated to do this. And so that cooperation may be very different under those circumstances.
Next question is for each of the public officials. Some communities across the country are moving in the direction of including mental health units in police departments to address some of the safety issues in communities. Is this something that you think could be beneficial?
Yes.
Yes.
100%.
And the next question is for State's Attorney Foxx. Your administration has pushed for reform with respect to various issues, including expungement of cannabis convictions, raising the minimum for felony retail theft, bond reform, and other reforms that data shows have resulted in a significant decrease in sentences of incarceration during your administration. What are some of your reform goals for community safety moving forward?
You know, as I said earlier, we spend still a significant amount of our resources on dealing with issues that should be best dealt with outside of the justice system. We just did a convening 2 months ago where we brought mental health and substance use disorder specialists together and said, here's what our universe looks like. Tell us how we can stop doing this. And the reason that this is important, I think people think of it in isolation, just people possessing drugs or selling drugs. When we look at people who are engaged in retail theft, we find a lot of folks who also have addiction or mental health issues. When we look at people who are stealing copper from houses, they're selling it to be able to go do something to help them with these issues. They're very interrelated. And so for us, when we're talking about using our resources, it really is about what is it that can bring our communities greater safety. I think our communities are safer when we have those resources in community and not just at the justice system. By the time a case gets to us, every other system has failed. If you believe that the criminal justice system is the savior for our public safety, and you don't believe it's education, or housing, or employment, if you are looking for the justice system, by the time a child reaches us, because we hear a lot about juvenile offenders, a lot. And they say to us, you're not doing enough to keep these juveniles in line. If I got a 14-year-old who's been arrested, there's been some failures way before it got to me.
Yes.
And so I think what we're trying to do is not absolve ourselves of our responsibility to look at these cases, but this is a shared responsibility. I will not let police or education officials off the hook. You know, when they call the police on kids in schools because, and we've had this conversation, because this person is problematic, I want them out because he yelled at me. And then we're having kids arrested in the schoolhouse, or their kids are fighting on the schoolyard, and that is a class 3 felony. It's a felony. And then it comes to us to like sort out. And so I think that is what my next term really will be about, is being bolder and more ambitious in disinvesting ourselves from doing the things that other people have an obligation and responsibility to do. You will not kick your mental health, addiction, juvenile issues to the justice system and say, you handle it not me.
Next question is for Trustee Walker-Peddakotla. The ordinance violation system has been utilized by the village to address youth safety and community issues. Is there a more ideal approach to dealing with the recurring issues concerning youth, such as vaping, smoking, bicycle, or helmet violations and property crimes?
So, yes, so this is something that Freedom to Thrive is focused on. A lot of the policy work that we've done, so there's actually this group called Local Progress, if you're interested in looking it up. It's a member group of Center for Popular Democracy. They're a group of super progressive local elected officials that put together a framework called Reform Transform, which we're using to evaluate all of our policies. Specifically, what we need to do is decriminalize what we currently arrest and stop young people for. And so a really good example of that is the vaping ordinance that just passed. I was trying to get purchase and possession out of that vaping ordinance, so that only the sale of e-cigarettes and e-cigarette related products would be in that bill. The first reading of it, I thought we had most of the board on board with that. And then by the second reading, the board flipped and we included purchase and possession of in that ordinance, and so that's what passed. What that means is that black and brown kids who we know get stopped at higher rates for smoking and marijuana will get now stopped for having e-cigarettes. And it's just not okay. These are things that when we're thinking from a racial equity perspective of who is going to be the most impacted, we need to think about that when we're creating policies like this. The other thing that we need to do is reform how our adjudication process works. What I've heard from young people that have gone through adjudication is that they don't feel like they are humanely treated. They don't feel like when they're sent to the township for community service that process is working any well. So we need a complete transformation of how is it that we're treating our young people that are going through the adjudication process in Oak Park, and yes, we actually have that. A lot of people don't know that we have our own adjudication system. How are we treating people that are going through that? Are we treating them humanely? And are we treating them in a way that we are not just punishing them for what they've done, but we're trying to help them get back on track so that this doesn't happen again, and we're providing them the resources and their families the resources that they need, because we're not doing that right now. And unfortunately, I, as one trustee, cannot make any difference. I'm gonna keep on repeating this point tonight, because I was the only trustee to say that these things needed to be pulled out of the bill, and I was able at the second reading to convince another trustee to agree with me, but 2 votes do not win. So again, 4 seats are coming up in 2021.
Thank you. The next question is for Commissioner Johnson. How have you been able to overcome obstacles or opposition to racial and economic equity you've sought to achieve through the policies you implement or support?
I think that's a very powerful question. I mean, it really comes down to organizing, sisters and brothers. These panels, I believe, can be quite effective in just re-energizing ourselves and providing some direction of where we've been and where we need to go. But we have to continue to organize, as our trustee just indicated. Though she is only 1 vote, the last I checked, people in Oak Park, y'all show up. You know what you do. That's a good thing, unless you, of course, you were the person that I beat. I will always be grateful to you all. But we have to continue to organize. Look, the challenges that we are experiencing right now, as it relates to how much this country invests, this country invests in policing. I've said this before, telling our stories is most important. That we're not just folks out here with an ideological frame that is not tethered to someone's real life. When I was before I was even sworn in, I met a sister named Bertha Purnell. And for like the first 6 months before I was sworn in, I would see her in my dreams. If you've ever had a conversation with Bertha Purnell, like she leaves quite that impression of you. But the reason why she left quite the impression on me is because she told a story that, quite frankly, is just too familiar. We have mothers burying sons. That is unnatural. It is so unnatural for everyone else. But somehow when black bodies are being policed and buried, that just becomes a news clip on Monday morning. It's unconscionable, you all. We have to continue to organize and tell the stories of our neighbors. The story of my children. I've said this before. Gunshots go off in my block. I've never taught my children to duck and take cover. My children are experiencing trauma. They got 2 black parents at home with degrees. And they're still experiencing trauma. I'll never forget real quick that when I was teaching in Cabrini Green, USA, the other community that raised our state's attorney, I would come home and tell stories to my wife about my day, and sometimes she would stop me in the middle of the conversation and say, "Brandon, that's not natural." And I would say, "What? I know he fell out the window, but we caught him." That's the big deal. What I'm saying is that we have become so accustomed to burying black sons, to watching black people get hemmed up by police, watching neighborhood schools shut down and close, Emmett Elementary School, just a few blocks from here, had higher test scores than the black students in Oak Park, and they still closed that school down. Come to Oak Park and try to close down a school. You all will burn this town down. It's not okay. So we have to continue to tell our stories. We have to organize. We have to understand that the policies that we are moving, they're connected to real lives. That's our work.
Thank you. Next question is also for Commissioner Johnson. Given the shifting demographics of various neighborhoods in Chicago, is there anything in place or planned to ensure the availability of public goods in areas of Cook County where they will become most needed?
It's not enough. Look, there are elected officials that probably won't say this stuff out loud. I'm going to say it. I know it's videotaped and it's Facebook Live. I believe in big government. I believe in the full expansion of all public accommodations. I want affordable free housing. I want affordable free education. I'll take a SNAP card right now with my 3 kids if you let me qualify for one. Here's why I'm saying this, you all. During the Great Depression, when unemployment reached 30% for white men, our country called it a national crisis. They literally began to give white men shovels before there was stuff to dig. They got free housing. They got to go to school for free. They got jobs. But all of a sudden, the brother who wants a W-2 is some sort of inconvenience, or we have to right-size the government. We have to shrink the government. We have to figure out how to have consolidations and efficiencies and closures. Austerity budgets are racist, period. Yeah. And so that if we want to see Cook County thrive, the fact that we have people in the Southland, South Suburbs, South Side of Chicago, past 95th, it takes them 2 days to get downtown. You have folks in the western suburbs that are trapped in neighborhoods who don't have access to clean water. Only a racist system that has been governed by white supremacy would allow black people and brown people to literally starve blocks away from other communities. East Garfield Park has been described as a developing nation, sisters and brothers. That's a half a mile from us, where the violence and the poverty per capita looks like a third world or a developing nation. And so yes, we have to have the leadership of people like Don Harmon to have a progressive income tax. And yes, we have to make sure that the wealthy pay their fair share. And absolutely yes, free college, free elementary school, free housing, as much public housing, as much stuff that we can get to people right now for free. I'm in support of that.
The next question is a combination of multiple questions that have been submitted, and it concerns cannabis. So the first one is, how can you use the upcoming cannabis tax money to build stronger communities? How can you employ restorative justice measures within your particular entity to address those who operate outside of the bounds of the marijuana laws that are set to take effect January 1st?
So this came up at our last board meeting last Monday. In Oak Park, we had a couple of weeks ago passed an ordinance that would allow for cannabis dispensaries in Oak Park, and we gave it a permitted use. And there is now a moratorium on that because the trustees wanted to revisit that. So right now, it is unclear whether cannabis dispensaries are going to operate in Oak Park and whether we are actually going to see any of that tax revenue. Now, I was, as a part-time elected official that has a full-time job, so that's the other thing that we should talk about, is the people that are doing the most change in the world often don't get paid or get paid below minimum wage. And so as a part-time elected official that has a full-time job, a very full-time job, and 3 kids, 2 of whom are just here, I am now looking at other communities and what they are doing. Evanston, for example, just passed an ordinance that where all of the tax money is going to go into a reparations fund. They still don't know what they're going to do with that fund or how they're going to use it. I don't think that would pass in Oak Park because our board is just not that kind of board, but maybe the sun will shine and that'll happen. I also think that one of the things that an alderman in Chicago had said is that unless you have a black partner in your cannabis dispensary, don't come to my district. I don't think he can actually do anything with that, but I think that we need to be looking closer at ideas like this and figuring out how we can make them work in progressive communities, and quote unquote progressive communities like Oak Park. Because I don't know if the state law goes far enough, right? One of the pictures that was circulated on social media is that everybody that got a license for a cannabis dispensary in Chicago was a white person. And that's not the way it's supposed to be working. So I think we as local municipal officials could do a lot more, but again, if y'all have ideas, please come to me and share them because I'm doing this while also managing all of those other things.
The next question is for State's Attorney Foxx. Are there any plans to review screening criteria for juvenile protection cases? Any reconsideration of the quote-unquote triad in medical allegations?
I don't know that I know what triad in medical allegations means. Listen, I think we're trying to be more thoughtful in how we use, how we screen cases that come into our child protection division. I was once a guardian ad litem. I represented kids who were in our foster care system. I can tell you one of the greatest, I think, injustices that I have seen was the number of kids that we needlessly brought into the criminal or into the child protection system. And a lot of people talk about the school to prison pipeline. You really ought to look at the child protection to prison pipeline. And so for us, it has been about more intentionality and the ability to say what are resources that people can get, again, outside of the child welfare system, more in-home services available before we take the leap and remove a child from a home. Because the harm that is done, the trauma of removing a child from a home, lingers with them. Unless you're me with my 4 kids, and you can have any one of them. Between 15 and 17, you can have them. But the lessons that we've learned is that, you know, when we engage, when we take children away from their families, there are long-lasting results that happen to that. And I think about the fact that I was a guardian ad litem starting in 1998 to 2001. Where, you know, as the population of kids coming into foster care was starting to decline, we still saw a significant number of largely Black, largely Latino kids who were being prescribed at that time Ritalin by the pound it felt. They were all being diagnosed with ADHD. They were all being diagnosed with, you know, reactive attachment disorder. I remember the lingo that we were seeing. And it wasn't until I had my own children and I was like, oh, this is 5. This is what adolescence looks like. This is what, you know, early childhood development looks like. To the point that our children, the point you made, Brandon, was very poignant. Our children sometimes have anxiety like everybody else, and then you throw trauma on top of that. They suffer depression like other people's children, and you throw other things on top of that. But our prescription for that was take them into care, prescribe them medications, do these things. And so we've tried to be more thoughtful about the cases that we screen in, believing, as I do with most things, that we should err on the side of not screening unless absolutely necessary to do so.
Thank you. The next question is for any of our public officials. What is your opinion on the community court?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, in fact, I believe it should be expanded, though that won't surprise any of you given my last statement. But, you know, I know North Lawndale has a community court, you know, where we are pushing restorative justice practices, and the chief judge has been very instrumental in helping to push that. I believe today, in fact, it's been made official that it's been expanded in Inglewood, which is a good thing. We have had some conversations preliminary here in Austin. I've spoken with Chief Judge Tim Evans. I believe it's a good idea. I believe it's, quite frankly, I believe it's necessary. And then I believe it allows us to reimagine what it means to be a community again. I know the state's attorney and I probably share this, this upbringing. Once upon a time, we didn't call it community court. It was just that's how it was, right? I'm trying to be careful here.
We took care.
There was other accountability mechanisms in place. If you were cutting up, there was support in the neighborhood to make sure that you got back on track. And whether it was uncles, aunts, or coaches, just neighbors. And I see a good family of mine, my campaign chair, Mr. DeBose, and Mr. DeBose, they've been in Austin for 40 years. They can attest to this. We knew each other on the block, right? I believe that the community court allows us to have just that level of expertise, that the level of care and sensitivity that we have to offer our community, that is presented. And I'll just say this, last part, is that the level of sensitivity and the thoughtfulness that we have to have when it comes to rendering some sort of judgment in our community. If people have not experienced that pain or they can identify a certain level of trauma, they're always going to be harsher. We've seen this in sentencing. There are studies that show, they've done studies with law enforcement in particular, where black children in particular, black girls especially, are seen 4 or 5 times years older than they really are. And so the punishment oftentimes reflects like what they perceive as an adult in front of them. So I fully support it.
Thank you. Those are all of the questions that we have time for tonight. Thank you for raising very important questions for our panelists. And thank you to State's Attorney Foxx, Commissioner Johnson, and Trustee Walker-Peddakotla for sharing your respective visions and your ongoing work on the re-envisioning of community safety. Can we give them a hand? The People's Lobby, Oak Park Call to Action, and the residents who organized this meeting are deeply committed to fighting the systemic racism and poverty that are the root causes of most crime and violence. The dominant narrative that deterrence and punishment will make us safer is very strong. We need each of you here to make a commitment to help us talk to our Oak Park neighbors about investing in communities rather than more policing and incarceration. In order to make those investments possible, we need to pass a graduated income tax. For too long, a flat tax has starved our state of resources that could be invested in public goods like education.
Don't leave that, y'all. We got more to tell you.
Like education, healthcare, mental health services, social services, and infrastructure. The budget impasse created by Governor Bruce Rauner nearly destroyed our social service sector and public universities. But before Rauner took office, Illinois ran a structural deficit for decades. We didn't raise enough revenue to adequately fund public goods while also keeping our pension commitments to public employees. So elected officials put off investing in pensions in order to put the bare minimum into other public goods. These cuts to public goods and services always hurt poor people and people of color, especially black folks first and worst. In November 2020, we'll have a chance to vote for a graduated income tax. Senator Don Harmon, who is here tonight, has led the fight to get this measure on the ballot. And now it's up. And now it is up to us to carry it over the finish line. Passing a graduated income tax, what we believe is a fair tax, will provide the state with resources to invest in our communities. It's not a given that those resources will be invested in communities of color, so that would be our next fight. But without more revenue from corporations and wealthy individuals, government will remain too broke to make those investments.
So, thank you, Erica. Passing the fair tax is super important, but it's not enough. Especially with Commissioner Johnson's comments today, we're going to have to work really hard in this re-election. But we got you. We got you. We need to strengthen public support for criminal justice reform, like the ones that Kim Foxx talked about tonight. And I want to be super, super clear about the fact that lives are at stake We are talking about the lives of people who we've already lost, and people who are already suffering. We need to step up and do what it's going to take to stop that and change those policies in our community. So affordable money bond means that thousands of people can go home while they're waiting for trial rather than being locked up while they're just waiting for a court date. Innocent until proven guilty is a sham if you're locked up before trial simply because you're poor. Alternatives to incarceration, like restorative justice courts, like Chief Judge Evans, who wants to expand that even further, we need to support that effort. And mental health treatment and probation allow thousands of people to have a second chance and to keep their jobs, custody of their children, stay in their house, keep paying their bills, keep their family together. Alternatives to incarceration are crucial for ending the school-to-prison pipeline. And reviewing old convictions means that Black folks convicted under falsified evidence or police torture can have their convictions overturned. Kim Foxx is doing that. There are two important ways that you can join us, okay? There's a lot of work to do, but we can all do it. Look at how many people are in this room. We could totally smash this. So I want you to make sure that in your stuff, this is your commitment card, and I want you to fill this out, and I want you to let us know when you're going to canvass, when you're going to phone bank, when you're going to come and help us out. We're going to be out there canvassing also for Money Bill. We're going to be doing lots of training, so if you're worried like, oh, I can't answer all those questions, we're going to help you with all of that. That's what the People's Lobby is really good at. So I'm going to invite you to come and canvass and to come and phone bank. If you're feeling afraid about talking to strangers, they're not really because they're all your neighbors, but think about the folks who are facing jail and facing separation from their families. Imagine that kind of fear. That makes the fear of going and knocking on somebody's door seem not so hard. I will have candy for you. So please commit to taking a relatively small risk and talking to your neighbors about what's at stake, about what you heard here tonight, and about what you know in your heart is what needs to be done. If you're feeling pressed for time, trust me, I get that. Remember that this commitment is only through March 17th. We have a very short window, which is great, but we need to hurry. So before, that's even before most spring break vacations start. So we're gonna jam this out between now and then. All right, this work takes money. I'm gonna ask you guys to give money. You probably already give money to lots of people. We need your money too. There are a couple ways you can give. You can give on your way out. There's computers set up. There is a QR code. Thank you, Suzanne Fairfax. You can just look at this QR code and it'll take you right to the donation spot. There's the good old envelope. We love the envelope, church folks. Any way you can do it. So please become a dues-paying member of the People's Lobby, which means like you give us $10 a month. You can do that. $5 a month. You can do it. We've got baskets. We can use those baskets. We really, really, really need that financial support. That money goes to paying for all kinds of supplies. We pay our babysitters, which reminds me, I want to say thank you to our child care folks tonight because the library is like telling us to go. Because it's really important that we make space for the people who are trying to take care of kids every day. A lot of us are, as Arti mentioned. That is a full-time job in and of itself, and we don't get paid. So we always provide childcare for our canvassing and our phone banks, and as we did tonight, thank you to the library for your help with that. All right, so we'll take your cash, we'll take your checks. We would love to have the donation envelopes. I would like to remind you about the resource sheet that was in your seat. There's materials in the back of the room that can help you get educated. Thank you so much, Ivan. Everybody, Ivan, wave. Ivan's got some reports back there that has some really startling but really important information in it. And I would love for you to take some time to educate yourself about that. All right, so remember that we in Oak Park won't be doing this alone. The People's Lobby is organizing all over. We got some People's Lobby folks in from Evanston. Woo woo. Thanks for coming down tonight. The People's Lobby organizes all over Cook County, and we are going to be putting the pedal to the metal, and we won't be alone. I want you to know how encouraged I feel to look out and see so many faces out there tonight that I know are going to do this work. Thank you so much for showing up tonight and for all the times that you're going to show up between now and March 17th and beyond. Have a great night, everybody.